Hot Water History, episode 177, Thursday night. Richard, we got a good one. What's going on?
Oh, a whole lot. And I am so excited to do this episode, like all of our previous episodes, but I'm even more juiced because this is right up our alley. It's hitting us right at the very purpose and telos goal of the podcast and much of our work.
This is one of the games you have circled on the calendar, especially when you have people on Twitter. It's always super fun when people on Twitter are getting involved and asking for a reaction and saying, you have to read this. What do you think about this? Or texting you on the side. So, the subject matter of today is a Catholic family news article, the Catholic economic debate against the Austrian school. I don't know if there's any first time listeners, but Richard, you're a pretty prominent supporter of the Austrian school.
Hmm.
And this is the famous Westerman Richard debate. Is it easier to make ANCAPs convert to Catholicism or Catholics convert to ANCAP? Well, this seems like another win for your side here
Feather in the cap.
because do you want to take a shot at describing this long article on by Christopher Ferrara
Yes, sure.
against the Austrian school?
Right. Christopher Ferrara is a faithful and traditional Catholic, very well read, intellectual who's contributed mightily in defense, for example, of the traditional Latin Mass. And he has been, although at one time a close friend of Tom Wood's, ever since graduate school or thereabouts, a kind of foil for Tom in the sense that whereas Tom has fully embraced and espoused Austrian economics and libertarianism, as well as really can be identified as a defender of an apologist for in the defense sense. Austro-Hungarian, not Austro-Hungarian, but Austro-Libertarian and anarcho-capitalist theory. Christopher Ferrara has been a vocal and acerbic opponent of Tom's, and all those who have contributed mightily, whether it's Hans Hermann Hoppe or in this case and in this piece, Ludwig von Mises and Murray Rothbard to the economic theory, as well as some of their writings on rights theory, as well as ethics of liberty.
And like I said, it's always fun when you get people saying, "What's your take on this? We need to hear you what you think about this," and give us your extended reaction.
Well, my reaction in reading it, and I did so carefully, tried to do my best in biting my tongue or writing immediately with three exclamation points marginalia, where I would vociferously and passionately argue against his points, which I find to be inaccurate in their assessment, oftentimes, inaccurate in the evaluation, and then furthermore, the analysis always kind of pitches toward essentially what I would argue is Christopher Ferrara, although I'll have to say he's consistent as I've read some of his other works, he is what I would term as a kind of Catholic exclusionist. And what I mean by that is in a non-Thomistic way and tradition, he wants to, as a result of people, in this case, two Jewish economists, not adhering to the Catholic faith, not even, for example, exercising a supernatural reception that's out of their hands of faith. And he does critique them for their poor, if non-existent natural theology, by which they, according to his mind, if they're so smart, Mises and Rothbard should have come to a rational conclusion that God exists, and then ultimately come to the realization that it is the triune God that we proclaim as Catholics and we who we love and adore. Well, then they're already off to a bad start, and their direction will lead them astray from the truth. Why I say that's anti-Thomistic is because, and he does allude to this a little bit in the piece, although I would argue not sufficiently. St. Thomas used, as did the scholastics, We'll get to the scholastics hopefully a little bit later, but he used Averroes and Avicenna, Muslim scholars. He used Moses Maimonides in terms of formulating his theology and philosophy on predication, the use of verbiage and vocabulary to describe God both apophatically and cataphatically. So in the negative and in the positive, what God is not versus what he is. And then he used, of course, pagan scholars, Plato, Aristotle, you name it. Uh, and it was because Thomas understood that while the church, as the body of Christ, is the portal of salvation, and it's through the church by which we are immersed in right revelation and proper doxology and teaching, it hardly the truth of natural and divine law, the uncontainable source of and font of wisdom is not necessarily contained in the minds only of Catholics and their achievements, their works, no matter how inspired they were to, in an almost infallible way, contribute. If it was the case, the fathers of the church don't all agree, even on seminal and consequential points of theology and philosophy. So there's that.
I want to read the conclusion so
Yes,
people get a
please go
better
ahead.
idea of the overview
Yes,
of
and this is
his
in an
case.
effort. This again in an effort to present Chris's take in the most objective and I would say equanimous mode. Fair.
What I have presented here is merely a glimpse into the abundance of moral errors inherent in Austrian thought. Any Catholic attempt to defend the assertion that the market is a natural corrective mechanism that fosters the proper ordering of human action must reckon with these fundamental flaws. Is simply ridiculous as I don't know what happened there, is simply ridiculous as anyone can see from the utterly degenerate state of our ardly secular market society and the very disjunction between public and quote private morality Rothbard insisted upon. Rather, that free system is wholly antithetical to Catholic social teaching on the moral limits to free market activity, the rights of labor with respect to capital, commutative and distributive justice, and the proper social relation between church and state, as seen in such monumental encyclicals Libertas Immortale Dei and Rerum Novarum by Pope Leo XIII, Vehementer Nos by St. Pius X, and Quadragesimo Anno and Quas Primas by Pius XI. Austrian thought has nothing to say to Catholics except this: reject it root and branch. The obstinate promotion of, quote, Austrian thought by Catholics is just another post conciliar Trojan horse in the city of God.
Wow. So that way Christopher Ferrara can show that he's not only knowledgeable of Greco-Roman mythology, but also Augustine's City of God. So a little bit of name dropping there, at least title dropping.
He's a
What
sharp
I,
dude. He's just wrong.
yes, that's true, and we can
That
be charitable in
happens.
that and say
He's a really smart guy,
he's
but
erudite, he's a fine writer. It's just his conclusions are all off. That can happen.
it's not the smartest lawyer that wins the case. It's the the ones with the best argument and the most evidence. So I
Right.
think I mean to give a little bit of my take,
Hmm.
I'm getting rid I told you I'm just getting a little tired before we recorded of I said people like this and maybe that's uncharitable. But when people treat the state as if it's like water
Mm.
and it's just this resource that's always there. Yeah, if you mix it with poison, it'll be poisonous. If you just drink it, if you just mix the straight Novocaine or something and drink it, yeah, it'll kill you and it'll do all these terrible things. But if you mix it with lemons and sugar, you make this great lemonade, and that it, it's almost like what you do with it is what makes it.
Yes.
But they never
But
get to the case that they never get to the case that
yes.
they they never make the argument that the state is good. They always just say that it's there and it's orderly.
Cr- Right. So interesting you note that, and it's a major going to be a major theme I suspect within our analysis and discussion is that they don't afford the same conditions or possibilities to the free market, which is simply an operation of a free society. That is why, in its praxeological approach and its definition, that is, say, the Austrian School's definition of praxeology as a methodology, as a method by which to ascertain how the market works and more so how human action proceeds. And then economics, in their definition, is just the deductive way post factum that one arrives at understanding human action in the context of moving from a state of scarcity to satisfy human needs and wants. And Mises and Rothbard are adamant from the beginning that as economists who have taken this position, they assert one a priori fundamental statement, and that is that humans act. Now, why that's controversial is in large part because from that statement and those logical conclusions that can be taken from that, the insistence of Rothbard and Mises, and from my perspective, from my knowledge, every other economist who would identify as an Austrian, is that economics as a result has to be from the German word wertfrei, meaning value free. It is a deductive study of human action. And when indeed both Mises and Rothbard get into complex arguments beyond the economic sphere about, for example, from where human rights, we can argue for natural law as establishing human rights, they're simply again operating from that first stance that there appears, and it's in many ways empirical, that there is an order governing the market. And in point of fact, it's not just an order wherein we mutually benefit from voluntary exchange, which they conclude is true. But beyond that, and this is what time and again Rothbard said was miraculous about the free market, is that even when there's an exogenous introduction in the free market of theft, which is an aggression against people, or fraud, well, guess what? Even in that, the market corrects. That's what is so miraculous, and for what we should thank God that he establishes a natural law wherein we as producers, consumers, and innovators or entrepreneurs, just people engaged in basic human exchange and social cooperation, we ought to give glory to God for that, not castigate and say the theories of the marketplace and those who defend it in freedom and voluntary exchange outside of coercion are simply promoting an anti-Catholic vision of natural law and morality and ethics. So what it moves me to conclude, as I think we'll touch upon as we go through the piece, what's absent in Chris's attack on Austrian economics, and indeed any concept of it is omitted from this attack and other diatribes, is a concept of human freedom and agency. They just don't like individuals determining for themselves what in the Adam Smithian context is most advantageous for them through subjective value theory of what they can do with the fruits and the effects of their labor, their production, their advanced foresight, their entrepreneurial activity, their manual labor. It doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things.
I want to read this paragraph too,
Okay.
because you just mentioned natural law.
Uh-huh.
Austro-Libertarians toss around the terms natural law and natural rights with no attempt to settle the question, what is man?
But
By leaving,
oh,
go
go
ahead.
go ahead. Forgive me.
By
Again,
leaving,
what I had noted here is simply that it's not an anthropological discipline. They're not trying to define other than what they can empirically see, yes, and assert logically through observation. And I'm not saying, by the way, that Austrian economics is purely an empiricist and not rationalist. It doesn't have rationalism as part of it. Far from the truth. But what I'm saying is, he wants them to take on all of this, all of the anthropological questions of God's relation to man and the like. But why are you requiring this of two Jewish atheistic slash atheistic agnostic economists? They're simply trying to show that within the context of subjective value, that when the market operates unhampered in a free flowing, non deterministic way, well, then indeed, the effects of it, we can conclude, are almost always mutually advantageous. That doesn't mean, or I should say, it's not necessarily mutually advantageous, but that the will and desire of the actors is accomplished in a much better way than what, for example, Rothbard describes is a type of Robinson Crusoe type of economy where you only have one actor attempting to cull natural goods for his own benefit. Indeed, when you have a multiplicity of economic actors, agents operating in their free will, with, by the way, the multiplicity and plethora of skills that they bring to an actually thriving market economy, then not just human prosperity, but happiness. And what Mises refers to, and I give credit to Chris about this, he does mention how, although he castigates Mises for this, that Mises identifies the state of man as being a rational creature, obviously ensouled, with not just a capacity, but a need, an inherent desire to satisfy or more so negate this constant feeling of uneasiness. And in Mises' conception, and Rothbard will later adopt this, is that this uneasiness is not just a material, although what I really dislike about what Chris does, he attempts to make Mises and Rothbard into materialists, as if the only things that, in his mind, Mises and Rothbard's Homo economicus cares about is the consumption, acquisition, and maintenance of material goods, and that is what they define as happiness or a satisfaction of this perpetual uneasiness, when in reality, they're both extraordinarily explicit through their magnus opum, right? Their works, their major works, in saying, no, no, no. It is to be determined by the economic agent, the individual actor, as to where they're to devote their energies to attain this freedom from uneasiness, whether again it be natural need or it be a spiritual like. And then he further, what really annoys me is that he goes on to say that, well, in their mind, therefore, everything is selfish, as if Mises and Rothbard are Gordon Gekko. They're not Gordon Gekko. This isn't Wall Street. That's a caricature, by the way, Chris. As actually, he caricatures both economists throughout the piece. So what they're saying, however, is that indeed, if you get to the basic root, and I will go so far as to say, and I don't know if we have time to go and elaborate upon this, I would go so far as to say that Chris Ferrara is conflating Ayn Randian objectivism with the Austrian School of Economics. And the reason I say that is because he wants to say that Mises and Rothbard are asserting that everything is a material driver, or there's this almost in their mind natural avarice toward consumption, and that there's no room in, as he says within the piece, there's no room in Rothbard's and Mises' conception of human action for altruism. But no, they go on at length in their works to explain altruism, in a sense, is selfish because the subjective actor is determining that by acting in an altruistic, let's just call it altogether charitable mode, that it is and does redound to the satisfaction of the uneasiness of the actor. So this is where I go, and we have an apology of and a defense of Austrian economics here by Caterina Lorenzo-Molo on the same site, the Catholic Family News site, which I can't express my appreciation enough for having this type of forum where these works are presented and
Right.
people are Catholics are in this sphere are discussing Austrian economics, catalytics, and the like. It's wonderful to see, and natural law theory, and Locke, and Mises and Rothbard, and you name it. So I'm so appreciative of this. Uh, it's in this that, remember, according to their contention, Wertfrei, that they don't want to impose or artificially insert a value system here because their goal is the study of human action rather than have it colored by or even prescribed by an ethical or religious theory and a theology that, yes, when we're seeking outside of this sphere or this activity of economics to further inform our worldview, as Caterina does, as Dr. Lorenzo-Molo does, we have figures like Archbishop Lefebvre, who adds to and supplements a much grander and beautiful, comprehensive notion of anthropology, theology, natural theology, and philosophy that we as Catholics are uh, bound to take on, to be sure, and at least converse with in a sense, or have our mental conversation with. But does that mean we are to reject the truths that are beautiful and inherent within two Jewish atheistic slash agnostic economists? I don't I don't see it. I'm certainly not convinced.
What is man? By leaving unanswered the question of man's nature and purpose in the universe, because they cannot agree among themselves on what man is, they leave behind the entire Greco-Catholic tradition of man. I can't stand reading this. A man as an ensouled creature with an eternal destiny, divinely ordered to life in what we call the state, with the state being obliged to order its affairs according to the divine and natural law. What is most ironic here is that while Mises and Rothbard are often portrayed as champions of reason, and the Austro-Libertarians would have us believe, neither of them was able to reason his way to the bare existence of God and the soul, and the implications of their existence for human nature and human happiness, knowledge which, as even the pagan Greeks demonstrate, and as the church insists, is accessible to unaided reason. Even radically anti-Christian thinkers of the so-called Enlightenment insisted upon the existence of a God who rewards and punishes, Voltaire being the most prominent example. It is a blinkered reason, indeed, that left the two leading lights of the Austrian school more in the dark than the pagan philosophers of Athens in the 3rd and 4th century BC or the deistic philosophies of the mid 1700s.
Philosophes, yeah. Well, here it's so funny that he mentions Voltaire because when you read Voltaire's philosophical dictionary and any reference that is made, even if he contributes to things like Diderot's Encyclopedia and other similar works, not that Voltaire himself did that, but in his philosophical dictionary, what is apparent when you look at, and he's in a sense giving a backhanded compliment of sorts to Voltaire, is that you end up with a personal anthropomorphism. Voltaire's Jesus, when he presents him, looks exactly like Voltaire and has the same values, correct? And so too, rather than accepting the insights, which are profound. Now Ferrara wants to just dismiss them as the fruit of a rotten tree from the onset. And rather than seeing their exposition on the law of marginal utility or the law of subjective valuation or diminishing return, and how those laws speak to the natural law and order that allows for production capacity, scarcity to be remedied, and that, for example, capital and labor can work and be cooperative in such a way so as to produce, yes, satisfaction and happiness, he wants to dismiss them offhand. And it has this ring of, well, Jesus would not have approved of the Austrian school, even though the Gospel of Matthew is riddled with examples of Jesus the economist being one, extraordinarily dismissive of the power, even the coercive power of the state, which ended up getting him in a lot of trouble. But furthermore, expounding upon the nature of proper capital usage and deployment, capital structure, marginal utility. And a lot of this is shocking, and it's said in your average Novus Ordo. I won't even go toward that controversy, but just your milquetoast Catholic parish. Well, that means God's understanding of economics is so. No, actually, when you look at it, Jesus is in keeping with the natural order that God has provided to us for the proper, just, loving, charitable, and hopeful functioning of human society. Not just the church, but human society.
I was listening to this podcast clip from actually from Catholic Founders. Shout out Silas. And he had, I wish I could remember his name, but Catholic Founders. So he's got all of these business guys on the podcast.
Hmm.
And I'm going to add a little bit to what he said, but he was talking about the over spiritualization of
Oh,
the entrepreneurial leap.
it's almost a Gnosticism, isn't it?
It's, I think it's because obviously to Catholics, the church is central to our lives, and being alive, money also plays a major role in our lives. And we
Mhm.
just, he was talking about how in the entrepreneurial leap case that we tend to people tend to over spiritualize the entrepreneurial leap. They'll say, is this my vocation? They'll go
Mm.
super deep into it. And sometimes you just have a really good idea and something that
Yes.
people want that you can
Right.
scale, and you should
Hmm.
just do that. And sometimes your idea just sucks
Correct.
and you should keep your job then.
Right. And as Mises said in those beautiful passages that we're so fond of quoting from in Human Action, you really have in the functioning of really any economy, there are going to be those who are able to assert valuation and thus become king. And it's either the consumers or some extrinsic force that arbitrarily assigns valuation. So the consumer can be king, the free market. If the consumer is king, the entrepreneur has to anticipate their need, desires, and wants. Now, those, again, it's important to realize too, and this is an error that we've talked about in the past, and even Dr. Lorenzo-Molo speaks of in the Apology for Austrian Economics, where Mises and Rothbard, as much as Ferrara wants to caricature them as saying that the free market is going to bring about some utopia, no, we we as Austrian economists and we as ANCAPs never assert, and it's a false uh, contention that enemies of capitalism in their anti-capitalistic mentality will assert and label us with. We're not creating a utopia. We're Mises and Rothbard, and what I appreciate about them is that they're more aware of the foibles, the shortcomings, the sin, the vice of man in the heart of man, the concupiscent tendencies of the hearts of man. But by which system do they find coherence with natural law that brings about the most justice? It's either the consumer and the producer in voluntary exchange and production, and those who are service, goods and services would be included here, those who receive services and the providers. Two, either they set those rules, standards, contracts, agreements, or some command and control center does it for them, in which case neither the possessor of capital nor the laborer is free. They are a slave to that entity to whom you ceded ultimate control who, by the way, that entity is in no way exogenous or outside of human nature. They're not just some sort of superiors, elitists who are able to divine what the cost of sugar should be or what an interest rate should be in 1978 Zimbabwe.
Right. Do you want to talk about the scholastics?
Just a bit in the sense that I have a pamphlet here. Where did I put it? The former president, we could call him the president emeritus of the Mises Institute. Oh, I know he's biased, but he wrote a nice little pamphlet here about
He
why
is a little
Austrian,
biased. Yeah.
yeah, he is. Austrian economics matters. By the way, Lou Rockwell, Catholic convert, traditional Catholic too. So he liked Guido Holzman, he liked Tom Woods. These are intellectuals of the highest order who not just find a total coherence of being a devout Catholic, but that with Austrian economics, but that, and I said this when Christopher Ferrara mentions that it's totally incompatible, the Austrian economics with Catholicism. Your and my contention is, and I hope we can convince others and persuade others, that it's not just contrary to Catholic theology, it's not contrary to Catholic epistemology and anthropology, but it's an optimal means by which to explain human interaction and social cooperation. So he goes into this that the Proto-Austrian tradition dates back to the 15th century Spanish scholastics operative mainly at the school at Salamanca, who first presented an individualist and subjectivist understanding of prices and wages. So we have this tendency, whether it's just because of our Anglospheric biases or provincialism, to think that economics began with Adam Smith refuting the mercantilists in the 18th century. And yes, many of the conclusions that were derived in opposition to mercantilism and its command control theories and praxis that we call economics today emerged from that period in time in response. But it's hardly the case that a defense of free market economics and laissez-faire it goes back well before, and we can even see it in, for example, as we mentioned before, the gospel as it speaks of human action and understanding it in the context of social cooperation. And moreover, the whether it's Juan de Mariana or Francisco de Vitoria or all the other scholastics writing at the time, they were trying and attempting to determine, well, how is it that we arrive at a theory of just price? What do we mean by valuation? Who determines the value of a good? And it's thankfully from the additions of men like Karl Menger and Eugen von Bauwerk, the founders of the Austrian School, and then Mises and Rothbard expounding upon their findings, that we have an elaboration, a beautiful and necessary elaboration of the subjective valuation theory and the marginal revolution, without which we have no true understanding of where we are able to determine a real price, a market price for things, which, by the way, according to natural law, as it turns out, is inevitable. If you don't have a market price established and you want to do a command and control system a la socialism and communism, if you don't establish and allow for that price to be asserted in the marketplace, then you just have shortage or you have little or nothing. You don't have a functioning true economy of social cooperation and exchange. You have scarcity again.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wish there was
Hmm.
more mentions of abundance.
Yes, that's the other thing. I wrote down here what, along with any concept of freedom and human agency that he at all even mentions or celebrates, that's operative within the Austrian economic system, if you will, or purview theory, series of theories. There's what we were just talking about. I just lost my train of thought.
Scarcity and
Oh, scarcity
abundance.
and abundance. Yeah, I mentioned, I was thinking of the Gamaliel principle. Nor is there an assessment of, well, we shall know them by their fruits. If the Austrians are so wrong, And those who are assertive of in a defense of praxeological defense of free market voluntarism, i.e., capitalism, which isn't so much an economic system as the negation of any type of, again, extrinsic controls on people's ability to contract and interact and exchange. Yeah. And an assertion that not any different than the Decalogue, the Ten Commandments, that you have a right to your property as you mix your labor with either natural resources and natural gifts or those that have already been had labor mixed with them, whether it be land or fruit or berries or nuts or whatever it might be, yeah, or water rights. Okay, yeah. So the only economic system and theories, or more so an absence of them, that produces prosperity and human flourishing. And I don't just mean the creation, as you said, of abundance. That's important, don't get me wrong, and profit's important because it allows for further innovation, research, development, and the like to go on in a dynamic economy. But it allows for the arts to flourish. It allows for leisure to take place.
Yes.
It allows for, as Leo the 13th articulated in Rerum Novarum over and over again, the flourishing of man in his diverse pursuits. And moreover, given the division of labor that becomes so obvious and operative in a free market, Mozart is allowed to do his thing rather than work in a steel mill.
Yes.
You see?
That's so important. And so many people don't even talk about that.
Right. Right. And one
That,
could say, one could argue, well, we had ballet masters in the Soviet Union. Yeah, Baryshnikov was connected, man. Okay, yeah, and there were people who were connected that had natural ability, but they were always put in service of the state. It was seen that the Politburo saw that there was a need to combat capitalistic claims that they had the best arts. So here we go. Or and he what's even more offensive is that he accuses Mises and Rothbard of a type of Bentham and Millian utilitarianism when nothing could be further from the truth. They're not. He's not saying, nor do Mises and Rothbard say that production is a result of the free market, just satisfies the material needs and wants or inordinate wants, because he's going to also attribute to it the seeds of avarice, which that's in human nature. Yeah. So he attributes all these terrible things to the free market, wherein all those things are endemic in command and control, and the type of statism that he even admits at the end is preferential to the free market operating in a laissez-faire system.
so you mentioned the fruits argument, and that's something that he actually brings up in the conclusion on the opposite end. He
Mm,
says that you can tell that I'm right because of the degenerate state of our market society.
yes.
That part is crazy.
Right. What type of societies produce
Yeah.
more degeneracy? The socialistic communist ones where the division of labor isn't operative, where people's natural skills, abilities, talents, thoughts, contributions are not rewarded, or in the free market where we have this abundance of goods and services that can be met out, an explosion in creativity and artists. And then he has the audacity to say the current state of Western economies is laissez-faire. Who are you,
Yeah,
Chris? What world are you living in?
right.
There's nothing, there's little that approaches an unhampered market operating in Western economies today. We live in for all intents and purposes, a nominal and actual socialist or quasi-socialist economy.
Right.
You can't have a state taxing in excess of 55%, thus siphoning off the capacity of people to act in freedom and attempt to, of their own volition and agency, satisfy their uneasiness, as uncomfortable as you are with that term, whatever it is. Let's just say determine how they should direct the fruits of their labor toward achieving their own contentment. Yeah. You can't have that when you have old this extrinsic entity that's siphoning off half of your productive capacity and you think that's freedom. The Egyptians were taxed at 10%. All right, I'm sorry, the Egyptians taxed the Israelites at 10%.
Right.
And God called them out of the out of there. Should we go on? I feel as though there's other things that we ought to. Oh, can we get to this is on page 5 of the PDF.
Okay.
This was particularly this incensed me to a point. I want to read this because he wants to just say that the conclusions of Rothbard and Mises are just all Locke. And Locke has become a type of all-encompassing boogeyman for trad Catholics who are into distributism and want to rail against the free market and capitalism.
Okay.
Those who are basically their status. Let's just say their status. They believe that there is the capacity of some group of elites who are able to better determine valuation for goods, okay, and how people arrive at happiness or how they should. And by the way, they all tend to be basically Amish Catholics who are just Jansenists. But anyway, based on this is from page 5 in the PDF. He says, based on his false Lockean premise that the motive for action is always uneasiness, Mises arrived at the derisory conclusion that, in quote, a man perfectly content with the state of his affairs would not act. He would simply live free from care. This conclusion, obviously, I hate that word obviously. I don't think you should use obviously in any type of persuasive argument because it puts way too much of an onus on you, or actually, it not only it can either put way too much of an onus on the writer to ensure that it's obvious, or it exonerates them from making greater argument, obviously, because any idiot would not conclude. This obviously negates eternal beatitude and even the very existence of God. Is that's a total leap? All Mises is saying is
I
that
remember this. This was the
men
yoga
act
stretch. Yeah.
out of a desire to attain their telos. By the way, teleology, the notion of goal orientation that man must, for example, when Thomas asks the question, what's the final answer to the question in the Summa? What is the final cause of man? The ultimate telos is God, is unity with God, theosis on earth, so as to, as Athanasius said, God was made man so that we might become God.
Yes.
Anything else, anything short of that is Lutheran bunk. It's Calvinistic shit. It's feces. This conclusion obviously negates the eternal. That's a total non sequitur. Because, and he goes on to say, and I'm going to make I think a more, I'm not going to say obvious, but clear argument. And for that reason, and that for very reason, Mises belittled scholastic philosophers, theologians, and likewise theists and deists of the age of reason, who conceived an absolute and perfect being, unchangeable, omnipotent, and omniscient, yet planning and acting. Since for Mises, action can only be imputed to a discontented being, it follows that an acting being is discontented and therefore not almighty. Well, he goes on to say, thus Mises concluded the very idea of absolute perfection is in every way self-contradictory, and the absolute is indeterminable, unthinkable, and ineffable. It is a chimerical conception. There are no such things. Is perfect happiness, perfect men, eternal bliss. He's speaking as an economist here, man.
Right.
He's
Yeah.
not
I
talking.
couldn't stand this part.
He could. If let's just extend this further. He's speaking as an economist and trying to explain how when act in the temporal sphere, when men act in the temporal sphere, they always act to satisfy this uneasiness. And it's not up to you, but to the subject and indeed moral agent and free individual to determine what is the best means and conduit by which to satisfy that uneasiness. That's what he's saying. He's not saying that what he's arguing is we can't rely upon and apply even, let's just say, our own Catholic epistemology and anthropology to a world that doesn't necessarily ascribe to it. It's akin to like saying to an atheist or some infidel, here's the Bible, there, you believe. That's what he's getting at. He's talking about praxeology, human action in its proper context. Then, this is wild. He goes on to say, according to the dictates of praxeology, then, Jesus of Nazareth, the perfect man, could not have existed. No, and this is what drives me crazy. The Virgin Mary could not have been sinless and perfect, and there is no such thing as eternal beatitude. Very early on in human action, the value neutral, wertfrei, economist blunders about the realm of Christian theology with remarkably obnoxious results. He's not a Christian theologian. You're asking him to
This
divine
isn't a
some sort
homily.
of,
This isn't a homily.
yes, this is not some sort of sermon to a congregation of already believing parishioners. It's not preaching to the choir. He's preaching to, in a sense, the world, universal. I don't want to call it saying he's a universalist. I'm not even going to go so far as to say that Mises would be at all comfortable with saying he's an essentialist. But he's saying deductively, as we look at how humans behave and interact in society, that we can't just simply apply a theology universally to them, to which they obviously don't all subscribe. And then here, this is what drives me crazy. When Mises is talking about, in quote, and this is from Human Action, a man perfectly content with his state of affairs would not act, he would simply live free from care. Mises does not exclude spiritual needs and pursuits from affairs. See, this is what drives me nuts. Ferrera is reading into Mises a dialectical materialism that just simply isn't there, and that Mises, time and time again throughout Human Action, is socialism. The middle road is socialism, which I was thinking of. It was another essay of his, which perfectly describes Ferrara. He wants to have a middle road that isn't socialism, but it always is. But in any case, what he's talking about here is, and Ferrara should know this, when Mises, and I can read back in Human Action, it's right here, is referring to perfect happiness, perfect men, he's actually not talking about their moral or essential state. What he's talking about is perfect, meaning they are lacking nothing. He's thinking of it, he's articulating this in a much more kind of Teutonic German philosophical sense. That, in other words, perfect means there's no person outside of, let's just state it in our Christian and Catholic theology. There's no person outside of the divine God man, yeah, Jesus Christ, who, but even in his human nature, right, was subjected, the divine second person of the Trinity, this is patristic theology, subjected himself fully. He was, as Paul says, fully God, fully man, right? He became a slave like one of us. He became a slave like one of us because he fully took on human nature. So he, in a sense, so fully imbibed and became man and a slave like one of us. And as a result, in his humanity, was subject to the uneasiness that we feel, the potentiality of becoming sick with a virus or a plague, the fact that we have to piss and shit, and we're bodily limited. You see, we can't teleport unless, as Christ could, of course, through the operation of his divine will and power. So that's what he means. He's not saying that there's an exclusion of the possibility that man could be perfect or redeemed morally in that sense. No, what he's saying is that you don't have man who exists per se as man, who is without suffering, in other words, pure act.
Well, I'm going to take it even a step further. He's not only not talking about, he's talking about people within government too. So he's saying there's no perfect men, so you can't set them as the people to determine the price of sugar.
Correct.
You can't have somebody, there's no perfect guy that's going to know the exact price that's fair for everybody on the price of a house.
Yes.
Which is why you need the market.
Well, and that's why you had Stalin so arbitrarily setting the price of steel and paper clips and doorknobs that he was using the ages and birth dates of his kids.
Right.
And then, of course, the compulsion was of those who were in the Stalinist behemoth bureaucracy. They'd say, oh, God, Stalin's defining yet again the absolutely proper and just price for paper clips. That's what you end up with, and that's an inevitability. It's a regression. So okay, those were big ones.
I'm curious about your highlights from the other side, from the
Okay,
apology.
okay, let's get into it. Could we say also that it should be pointed out, and I do credit Tim Gordon for reminding me of this with his recent episodes on Rerum Novarum. The whole establishment, and for all intents and purposes, papal imprimatur on subsidiarity that was always bantied about and for the most part operative in Thomas and the Scholastics, although never explicitly affirmed, is explicitly affirmed in Rerum Novarum. And where does basic private property rights come into Catholic theology and epistemology? It's in Rerum Novarum, and it comes straight from John Locke. Again, a man who was not a believing Christian for all intents and purposes, and yet he was able to contribute mightily to property rights theory. And by the way, I think it's just a ridiculous argument to say, well, there's many more rights to inalienable rights than basic property. All when Mises and Rothbard, whether it's in Ethics of Liberty or you have subsequent Austro-Libertarians talking about inalienable rights, what they're just boiling it down to is the same lesson of the Decalogue. Namely, that fundamentally, when you're talking about unalienable rights, it just means those things that cannot be taken from you as a result of you having ownership of your body and of your intellect and of your reason, proper functioning, and your capacity to, as a free moral and acting agent, act. Anything, in other words, everything is an aggression upon that and ought not to be pursued.
Right.
And in the Decalogue, God just elaborates so beautifully. If we just followed that, well, we wouldn't have that the negative consequences, which are all in many ways just defined as theft or fraud and incursions, and we might call them, well, violations and aggressions against each other. So yeah, he just doesn't want to admit that. Let's talk about let's get to where did I put Dr. Lorenzo-Molo's piece? So this is entitled The Austrian School as Checkmate to Liberalism and How Archbishop Lefebvre Fine-Tunes It. Let me go so far as to first read her conclusion, which I know it will surprise no one listening to the podcast, agree with. But she talks so beautifully about where the failures are, or more so let's not call them failures, but limitations of the self-prescribed goals of Austrian economics and how they need to be informed by Catholicism. Obviously, everything needs to be informed by Catholicism. So she says this, or writes this. Even if reasonable and logical thinking of which the Austrian perspective is premised is adopted and maintained, it is important to note that man left to his own devices, i.e., no faith, no sacraments, no grace, has a much lower probability of choosing what is best or better, as the reality of Austrian thoughts, failure to become dominant and mainstream attests. So she actually it's a compliment to Austrianism. I mean, in other words, the Austrians are not deluded as to think that through a study of catalytics and the operations of the free market, one comes to right moral and ethical decisions in participating in the free market. No, that requires virtuous, eudaimonistic living. So in other words, that virtue contributes to the just functioning and even human advancement and prosperity and happiness, as opposed to vice, which in the end, although the the anticipation is myopic for the gains and always ends up in ruination. They what Ferrara wants to assert is that the market does not account, in fact, is naturally, see if this sounds Marxist or not, is naturally exploitative because it invites fraud, theft, and abuse because the vicious in the end always win. But wait a second. again, the market, if you leave it unhampered, would account for that much more readily than if you have a cabal of crony, quasi-capitalist, socialist, non-capitalists, really, and command and controllers operate or determine valuation within what would otherwise be a functioning economy of free exchange. She goes on to say, man left to his own devices is not more likely to remain reasonable because unless he recognizes and embraces the logos and remains with nature without grace, material prosperity without the searching for eternal goods, politics without God or Jesus Christ, the rights of man against the rights of God, especially when the civil power is separated from the ecclesial power, and freedom without truth, the struggle to find solutions to problems in the temporal will only ever be temporal, and the probability of achieving a permanent solution, which is to save one's soul, will also be lower relative to those who have embraced the Logos. In other words, what she's saying is, look, a truly devout, informed, effectively catechized, believing, prayerful, contemplative Catholic will actually embrace the operations, the theories, the ideas of laissez-faire because in no way do they inhibit the ultimate goal and telos of man, which is happiness in life, to serve God and others in this life, so as to be united with him in the next. Well, Baltimore Catechism. She goes on to say, oh, and I have a big point here that I think you'll like. But unlike ecumenism, where the church seemed to give up what in economic terms would be referred to as leverage, the Austrian perspective, with its non-Catholic, e.g., Rothbard, and non-Catholic practicing thinkers like Karl Menger, did the reverse of the Catholic Church hierarchy at Vatican II, when the church compromised with the world. Isn't that beautiful? She's saying the Austrian economists are not going to compromise with the world. The likes of Rothbard and Menger, as non-Catholic and non-practicing Catholic, who did not yet know the fullness of truth and were not assigned to officially shepherd a flock and evangelize as successors of the apostles and as alter Christus, another Christ, they nonetheless saw a logic and beauty in Catholicism. It should be noted that Rothbard was very complimentary of Catholicism. More so, he deemed that Catholicism was it's Catholicism that not only is the by and large generator of and protector of capitalism and free market defenses. Protestantism is socialism and statism writ large. At least it's given a theology, and vice versa. Um, she says this was not their job. They saw a logic and beauty in Catholicism, specifically in the works of St. Thomas and the late scholastics, which they adopted into their secular framework, concerned with understanding man in the business of finding solutions to problems in the temporal world, mostly pertaining to maintaining his existence. What I love about that is I suspect that, and this is going to be reading some limited intent, although I will say it's with the previous evidence that we've already gone over. I suspect that it is the Austrian school's principled, untrammeled stand, non-negotiable stand in not trying to mollify its theories, mollify its assertions, its core principles that most unnerves Ferrara because the church was so willing to do so in its attempt to satiate modernist demands. In other words, do you see what I'm
You're
articulating?
saying they're too autistic to change, and the church wasn't really?
Yes. Yeah.
Why would that,
Especially in light of
why would,
ecumenism and modernism.
and why would that drive Ferrara the wrong way?
Because he wishes the church would have stood more resolute and
Oh,
not
I get what,
subjected itself
I get what
or
you're saying
given
now.
in and conceded to at least the spirit of Vatican II. As the Austrians refused to concede to anti-capitalist mentalities, the Austrians refused to concede. I mean, we have to remember that the Austrian theory and libertarianism as an ideology was pretty much dead as a doornail with a handful of practitioners who would meet with Rory Rothbard and have all night discussions in his parlor. The Gene Epstein's when he was in New York or when he's banished out to the University of Nevada at Las Vegas. It was Keynesianism was triumphing. I mean, we had the president of the United States doing very un-Austrian things like removing the dollar peg to gold in 1971, declaring in the aftermath, we're all Keynesians now. We're all Keynesians now. And then here are the Austrians saying, screw that. Mises is, well, he's gone, but Rothbard's carrying on the tradition and saying, I don't care what the world says. It's very Athanasian. Maybe, and we've talked about how before that given our spirituality and certainly my not just affinity, but recognition that Athanasius is my patron in heaven, and my spiritual father, his just assertive and never wavering, unwavering belief, and no matter what others said, sum contra mundum, I'm against the world here. The church wanted to reconcile with the modern world and all of its obvious vices uh, in the Vatican, post-Vatican II world or environment. The Austrian school said, we're still not going to budge from railing against central banking and Keynesian stimulus and the like because it's destructive.
Any other thoughts?
I have a ton of them, but we can only do so much time on an episode. I would just, if I could conclude here with just some of my own that I've written down, some of which we've already covered, so I don't want to be redundant, but I don't also want to omit any gems. Yeah, let me just state this because I wrote this down. In the scheme of both of the pieces, Ferrara's critique, and we touched upon this, appears to be obsessed with the failure of two Jewish economists to be more effectively impositional in both their economic and rights theories. Like you said, it's not a sermon or a homily to a respectively evangelical or Catholic congregation. I went on to say, nor does Ferrara ever point out, we did touch upon this, the Gamaliel principle, how the notions of entrepreneurship, individual liberty, and the division of labor contribute mightily to man's true happiness, objective and subjective attainment of goals, satisfying of the uneasiness that through natural law, in fact, through original sin, is introduced into our nature. In other words, there's no real mention of man acting as as rightly um, a free agent. By the way, I love that our T-shirt on hotwaterhistory.com. I'm not doing merch promotion so much, although I guess
That's
it
what it
comes.
sounds like.
It's yeah. But there's a line from Irenaeus: "Man is born a free agent." It's directly from Adversus Heraeus. Man is born a free agent. You can't have a moral being or a being that is incumbent. It is incumbent upon him to choose the good, to do good and avoid evil, without having the freedom, especially as God, both the triune God in the Old and New Testament in the totality of Revelation, always mandates, and he can do that because he's the divine mandator in his perfection. Again, no potentiality. Well, he's the one that calls us to proper and just social interaction and cooperation. That's what's beautiful. We've said it before that Mises wanted to name human action social cooperation. And he's just an economist who brilliantly expounds upon that.
Do you want to talk about a town where most of the people living in it have no idea anything we just said?
Well, they know socialism. They know socialism. They know that there ought to be an elite oftentimes devolving into a cabal and cartel, determining what they should value morally and in the marketplace. Let's hit it.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
We should go to your gay suburb now.
The People segment, Meanwhile in Oak Park, brought to you by Trinity Brewing. Shout out to Trevor.
Should we throw in an introductory caveat here to listeners who are just new to the podcast, who really wanted to hear us expound upon the Ferrara / Catholic AL debate?
Oh, for the first time listeners, you want to explain Meanwhile in Oak Park?
I'm giving the floor to you, Charlie.
So we are expecting some first-time listeners. For the rookies, this is the segment that some people skip to if they don't want to listen to us talk about topics of Catholicism, history.
That's because, a la Ferris Bueller, it's so choice.
But if you're not familiar with Oak Park, we're gonna familiarize you with it a little bit. But how would you describe it? Let's just put it this way, let's just use facts only. 90%
Get ready for a landslide of just projections.
90% of people voted for Kamala. That is a fact. That's not a projection. That did happen.
Yes.
In 2024. So this isn't exactly your home for freedom or prosperity or some of the topics that we've met, or Catholicism, as we're going to see in this first article, unfortunately.
It's not a Narcopolco. No.
No. And I think it's worth mentioning that Oak Park, Illinois is a very beautiful suburb naturally of Chicago, and it's got a nice aesthetic out of the natural trees. Just even the streets, I think I know you complain about the traffic and potholes and stuff.
Let's just summarize. It's a smaller, tiny version of Leningrad with a lot of good wine and cheese and pride flags.
So yeah, maybe that was better said.
No, where do you dispute my analogy? Is there anything was I missed there?
No, I thought that was good. Final St. Catherine St. Lucie Mass, one of hope. Austin Oak Park Parish's legacy will continue with school ministries. Parishioners of St. Catherine St. Lucie Church embrace while attending the last mass.
Notice some black singers up on the ambo or pulpit, and the priests are all in the congregation. Hey, gee, I wonder why it's closing.
Prior to Sunday's final mass at St. Catherine of Siena St. Lucie Catholic Church, organ music settled over dozens of congregants as they filed in, joining their voices with hundreds more in the nave. Here stood the statue of St. Lucie holding an olive branch and staring down at the sheer throng of people, an estimated 800 who made the trek from around the area and even across the country to partake in the Eucharist one last time at the church. Okay, so a little more mention of God than last week's article.
Yeah, more than I expected.
Greeter George Jones, a kindly black man pushing 90 years, smiled brightly and shook hands with virtually everyone who entered. Reverend Carl Morello, pastor of St. Catherine, St. Lucie, and St. Giles, darted around making sure final preparations were coming together.
They were so welcoming of all the Gnostics and heretics filing into the church one last time.
I don't know if that's charitable. I seriously don't. I don't know if that's...
It's always charitable, Charlie.
Over there was a man with his arms crossed and a somber countenance, as if in realization that the end was finally here after the announcement March 2nd that the church at 27 West Boulevard in Oak Park would be closing.
The writing is actually not bad so far. I mean, given the standard that's usually set by the Wednesday Journal.
But for the most part, this was a day of celebration, of reuniting with family and old friends and classmates from St. Catherine St. Lucie School. Of tears, yes, but of laughter and handshakes and hugs as well. Quote, "The sadness we feel is real," Morello proclaimed during his homily. "We cannot rush past it, but today let's honor it. Let's also let it open up to what is next, because God is not done with us yet. Amen."
Amen as a question? Yes.
And in one voice...
he sounds like Anchorman, Rob Burgundy.
And in one voice of those in the congregation, perhaps also the many who flowed through its doors since the current church building opened in 1931, everyone responded,
You stay
Amen.
classy, St. Lucy?
Later, Morello asked that everyone who had been baptized at St. Catherine St. Lucy please stand. Dozens upon dozens did so, everyone from the young to many with nests of gray hair.
That'd be great if he announced all of the baptisms were invalid because we used the improper doxology. So, are you ready to get wet?
Run it back. There were also plenty who had gotten married in the crowd, like Carrie and John Pescius, who did so back on December 15th, 2007. There was a big snowstorm that day, which contrasted with Sunday's sweltering mid-90s heat. Quote, there are a lot more people here today than there were at our wedding, Carrie Petches deadpanned after services were complete and dozens still milled about in front of the altar, taking final photos. In chatting with the couple and their young son, it was clear that St. Catherine St. Lucy's impact transcended both time and space. The Peach Houses are from LaGrange and made the trek over, but there was more. Let's see the pictures. The choir
Yeah. It's a beautiful
was a
church.
beautiful church.
Yeah.
I would argue it's symbolic of a park in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
This is kind of sad. Quote, my parents actually got married here, so it had extra meaning to us, John Petches added. The two who had perhaps the best view of the proceedings were the brother and sister server team of Aaron and Ava Konecki. What was it like being on the altar and realizing this was it? Quote, lots of waterworks, said Ava Konecki, who attends Xavier University in Cincinnati. I took a lot of it in, like looking at the stained glass windows and just how intricate. And I remembered back to when I was a kid and sitting and looking at the lights.
Shouldn't have been on the altar, Ava. No girl servers.
Quote, growing up here, she added, fighting back tears, it made me really emotional. It was hard, but I pulled it together. Ditto for her brother. Quote, it was very surreal because I kind of grew up in this church and my dad, he's been here since he was a kid. And now I've been there and it's very, very sad to see it go, said Aaron Konecki, who attends Opera. Valerie Jennings, who lives in Austin, has been a parishioner at St. Catherine St. Lucy since the 1980s. After St. Catherine of Siena and St. Lucy merged in 1974, she spoke at the beginning of the service. Quote, I found myself having to just hold it down, Jennings said, adding she broke down and cried at communion. Quote, that's why we come to feast upon the table. And I look at that table. And I look at that table one last time. I'll never be able to eat at that table again.
All this bullshit about it. Oh, the mass is a meal.
I'll eat at the table of God somewhere at St. Giles and other places, but this is home. It was tough at communion. After the service in the sacristy, with robes and vestments put away one last time, Morello reclined on a chair and let his own emotions catch up with him over months of prayer and preparation. Quote, being the celebrant, you try to hold it all together spiritually because, as I said, there is the bitterness and the sadness, but there's also the hope of who we are as a people of faith, he said. So it's a lot of pressure. But as a man of faith, I count on the Holy Spirit, and I would say at the end of it all, the Holy Spirit showed up.
Slapped us all around. The Holy Spirit did show up. It's because he wanted to slap you around.
Have you ever heard the song, the joyful song titled Every Praise? I know how much you're into modernist hymns.
Oh yeah, you know me. Me and the St. Louis Jesuits. Tight.
Morello stood and began clapping, and suddenly everyone stood and joined in, which concluded with thunderous applause. While the St. Catherine St. Lucy Church building is now closed, Morello pointed out to the congregation that its legacy will continue. St. Catherine St. Lucy School will remain open, while Sister House, which offers a temporary home to women seeking recovery from substance abuse, will remain in the church's former convent building. The neighborhood bridge and the faith and fellowship ministry will continue to operate out of the repurposed rectory, along with Housing Forward and emergency overnight shelter. And as the congregation united their voices in St. Catherine St. Lucy one last time, they sang a closing hymn of hope. I got a feeling everything's going to be all right, be all right, be all right.
Is that just bad Bob Marley?
I don't know if they they threw I Got a Feeling by the Black Eyed Peas on the aux to close it out.
Yeah. Well, there you go. That's Catholicism in Oak Park.
Here's a
Is this the
interesting
last
one.
story?
This says,
Oh, cool. All right.
Man shatters Oak Park grocery store's window with headbutt. A man wearing a helmet
Or it was a bike
headbutted.
helmet. It's got to be a bike helmet, right?
A man wearing a helmet headbutted through a plate glass window at an Oak Park grocery store. A man wearing a helmet headbutted his way through an Oak Park grocery store's plate glass window in a fit of rage last week, according to Oak Park police. Shortly before 11:30 p.m., June 14th, a man wearing a helmet struck his head against the 5 by 7 foot plate glass window of a grocery store in the 400 block of, why don't they just say,
Yeah.
in the 400 block of Madison Street.
Hmm.
The man then fled westbound on Madison Street while riding a black moped, according to police. The incident caused an estimated $2,500 in damage, according to police. Wow.
How about, did they catch the guy? No.
That's all. That's all she wrote.
Yeah.
Another
We got a
carjacking.
little police blotter going on. I like it. Let's go.
2024 Honda Accord. The man reportedly rented a car. He rented the car and never returned it.
That's awesome.
The vehicle has an estimated value of $30,000.
Oh, like they got to have a tracker on it, don't they?
Haven't found him.
Maybe they took the tracker off. Hey, all right.
Police arrested an Oak Park man on domestic battery charges.
Okay.
Tool theft. Several
Tool,
incidents
tool
of
theft,
tool theft.
otherwise known as kidnapping in Oak Park.
Someone stole a chainsaw and wet saw. Someone stole
Or
two
still Illinois.
nailers, two saws, two drills, and a set of tool batteries from a van.
Hmm. That sucks.
Yeah.
Yeah. Petty crime. That doesn't happen in Oak Park. It's not supposed to.
We need mobsters again.
Oh, for sure.
Our
Code of
criminals.
ethics.
I was actually talking about, you would love this. I had this Uber driver from Midway,
Hmm.
and he was a very, I don't know if conservative is the word, but a very old school South Side black guy,
Okay.
and just was
Gonna be the best.
he spent half the car ride just ranting about the pride stuff,
Oh man.
ranting against pride stuff.
Yeah.
And one of the things that he was saying is that I didn't even know this. You know how how gangsters sag their pants?
Mm-hmm.
So he was telling me that that actually originated in prison,
Yes. Yeah.
where if you sag your pants, you're the guy that's ready to go.
I guess. Yeah. That's what
And
I heard too.
he was saying that today's gangsters, today's criminals, even they've gone gay.
Mm-hmm. Well, think about, I mean, Leonardo Joni has those great posts about how gay rappers are. They're all, have you ever seen Tupac, the interview with Tupac when he was in high school?
No.
He's gay. And all the stuff that's going on with Diddy.
Oh yeah. That
So, yeah, there's clearly a correlation, how far it extends, to what degree.
but it
But
was just one of those combos that you would never have if you weren't in an Uber.
yeah, right. How
And he
did
was
you
just
approach the subject? How did you start talking? Oh wait, should we call it a segment or no?
this is the people segment.
That's a segment.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
What would have happened if I'd gone for it and just said, no, I'm gay.
It's people segment. Go ahead. Okay, sorry.
I forgot how it started, but it wasn't a very two-sided conversation, honestly. It was early in the morning. I was just trying to get home, and I was just kind of, I was egging him on a little bit just to see where he would go.
What do you think about all these rainbow flags around, Buster?
He was talking about I assume he was Christian too,
Mhm.
and he was talking about, man, I can't stand these preachers now. All these guys, they got mansions, they got the best shoes. These guys are frauds.
Yeah,
So
good
we
for
talked
him.
about that a little bit,
That's cool.
but he was
He was based.
he was based
awake.
for sure. for sure. He was like, he was talking to me about this street fight he watched growing up,
Okay.
where this one dude who was a really respected guy in the neighborhood basically got jumped by this gangster that ended up being gay. And the way he knew he was gay is that the respected guy
He
fought
jumped on his
back.
back and wouldn't let go.
The respected guy fought back, right?
Uh-huh.
And and
Stop it.
he told this story so much better than I did. Where
Okay.
he said the gay guy, he threw three punches. He threw one, two, and then he backed up and he goes, "Fucker." And he threw the third punch like that. He goes, "Fucker."
This next one's gonna be savage.
Yeah. Yeah. And that was his, I guess that was his turning point, witnessing that street fight that something
man,
was in the water.
these guys are gay.
Yeah. That's kind of how it went.
That you know what else gave away? All the butt sex.
Yeah.
Drug giveaways. Yeah.
So
Punch like a girl, lock it up the anus. That's it. I figured it out after that. All right. That was fun.
yeah, that was. We
I
found the
doubt we're gonna
mystery.
get any
We found
we're
the
not gonna get any
mystery.
calls or Christmas cards for Chris Ferrara, I don't think.
No.
That's a shame.
We found the, I'm not going to dox him, but we did find the mystery Park Ridge man. That was exciting.
The Mystery Park Ridge Man. What was that?
Remember about the story I said at the end of last week's episode where
Oh
Where is
yeah,
it?
yeah. Yeah.
let's not dox him. We'll talk to
No,
him
we're not gonna
about,
dox him, but that was funny.
he'd be a good guy to have on actually, but
One day, one day. It seems though people get kind of implicated if they're associated with us, right? So some people like that to be implicated and connected. Others, maybe I'll just wait for my career to develop before I leap onto the Hot Water History podcast.
yeah, the
I'll be
water
a
might
little bit
be,
more secure in my life.
you dip your feet in the hot water and
It's addictive.
I'm not sure if my head's going underwater for most is I think the thought process.
Yeah, yeah. Am I drowning here? This is kind of hot. This is hotter than I thought.
Yeah,
It didn't say boiling
right.
history. So, but all right. Well, Charlie, God bless you. Thanks for reading the article in peace and all that, keeping me on track with all of my thoughts.
Yeah, this was a good episode. Everyone, hot H2O history on Twitter, Chuck West 20 on Twitter.
Buy yourself a not gay t-shirt.
Fun dialogue. That too.
Saintly libertarian / anarcho-capitalist t-shirt. That's where the synergy is clear there. The need for both. And then could I just shout out to St. Matthew, whose intercession we called upon for this episode, and I think he was present and graced us with supernatural grace through him and from our Lord. So
Who's he the patron saint of?
economists, also accountants, and unfortunately tax collectors, which Charlie, meter maid or tax collector, what would you rather be?
I'd rather be a tax collector.
Okay. And then just take all the money and give it back to the poor like Robin Hood. I like it. But you could do that as a meter maid.
Not really.
Yeah, I guess not. Yeah. So yeah, just turn a blind eye.
I
am
could
the-
never be.
I am the worst IRS agent ever. Of course, I can't get fired because of the government bureaucracy. I'm in, but all right. God bless everyone. Good night. Thanks. Peace.
Peace.